Hello everybody. Let's make a hand casting. So hopefully if you had access to, you've already watched the prior two videos about hand positions and the materials that you will need to complete this project. Your alginate, your plaster, your buckets, your plastic, your newspaper, your 2-liter soda bottle, and your plan. What are you going to do with the positioning of your hand? So a couple things just as a reminder, I think this is really important just to hear again. There are lots of different kinds of alginates and companies that are making the alginate. Some of them contain silica and they're still really beautiful alginates to use, but you need to be aware of the health hazards and wear a respirator and be in a well-ventilated area and be cautious. There are also alginates on the market like this Monster Gel that does not contain silica. It has a label that says CSF for certified silica free. Every alginate brand and company is also going to have a variety of alginates available. So on the label here, there's a fast, regular, slow set. And there's also a traditional. The traditional is the one that does contain silica. So the fast usually sets in like 3-ish minutes. That's quick for a beginner. You don't want that. Regular is what we have, and it's about like a 5, 6, 7-ish minute work time. Some of that depends on the temperature of your water, and I'll talk about that. And then there's also a slow set time. Now, some of the decisions you want to make determining what kind of alginate to get have to do with the kind of mold that you're making and your experience level. So if you're doing something super tiny and you don't have a lot of complexity, you can probably get away with the fast set alginate. For beginners, medium set time, the sort of like 5 to 7 minute range is usually pretty good. You have to think that like there's mixing time involved, but then there's also the time that your hand has to stay inside of the form. 5 to 7 minutes with mixing is usually not a terrible amount of time to wait. But if you were to do like a full body casting or more than just your hand, you would probably want something with a longer set time. There are also alginates that can vary depending on if you're doing a bucket mold. So we're going to be putting the alginate in a bucket versus a layup mold where, like I've been kind of describing, there are people processes where you can put the alginate on your face with a partner and an assistant and proper breathing holes. And once that sets, then you cover it with plaster bandages, and that's considered a layup mold. And that one also would take a little bit more time, but also a stiffer alginate. Alginate is also a material that the that the alginate water mixing ratios, so how much water you add to how much alginate, can actually vary quite a bit depending on the consistency that you want. So you could get the same alginate to do a bucket mold and a layup mold just by adjusting the water. So that's an important thing to know about alginate, because it's not true for all materials. If you adjust the water or what the sort of mixture ratios, you can end up with something very different. Let's see. Water temperature. So I think I kind of hinted at that. Each alginate brand is going to have a very different requirement for temperature. There are some alginates. There's like a company that has alginates which is called a 780, and so that means that if you have 80-degree water, it will take 7 minutes for your alginate to set. So they're kind of coding temperature and time together. And then they'll also indicate that if your water is warmer, your set time will be lower. So you'll have less time because the heat activates the setting process. Or if you lower the temperature of the water, you end up with more mixing time. So it varies greatly. You want to read the instructions that come with the material, but you also want to experiment a little bit with it before you dive in to do your full project. And this is where this video specific to this alginate and you as my students watching this video is very important, because I had never used this alginate before, and I wanted to test it out. So I tested it out in small batches, And just at the beginning of starting to mix it, I was like, this isn't right. Something doesn't quite seem right. It was super thick. And I re-looked at the ratios, and it's exactly what they had said to do. I went on the internet and found the same answer from the company's website. I went to a couple other sources that I kind of trusted, and they hinted that it maybe needed just a little bit more water than was indicated, but I still didn't find that that was even enough for my liking. So I'm going to be telling you a very different ratio to work with for this project. So please listen up when I talk about the ratios for water. And as I think I had started out talking about, the temperature of the water is important for this alginate. This alginate does like a slightly warmer temperature water, so we're looking for about 80 degrees. So if you think about the average temperature of a house being around 70, you want it just sort of slightly warmer than that. I do happen to have one of these just like cheap little kitchen gadgets to measure the temperature, and so I was able to use that to kind of get it close. You know, it feels comfortable to the touch. It's just a little bit warm. I haven't found that temperature affects this alginate so much in the way that it does with other alginates I've worked with, meaning if it's slightly hotter or just slightly cooler, it's not going to affect it too much. But reading on the internet does indicate that this one does not like super cold water. So that is kind of at least something to avoid, is like turning your water onto cold, letting it run for a minute, and then using that water. That would be too cold. Also, it would be really uncomfortable on your hands. So, okay. Ratios for mixing. So again, listen really carefully, because this is different than if you look up the measurements online. And also, I'm giving myself extra water to allow for some flexibility. So 1 part alginate. We're going to do 1 part alginate to 1 part water to start out with. This is 16 ounces or 1 pound. So I have 16 ounces of water. I'm sorry I don't know the cup conversion off the top of my head if you don't have a bucket with measurements, but you can look that up. 16 ounces, how many cups? So we're starting out with a 1-to-1 ratio. But I have an extra cup just of yogurt container that has 16 more ounces of water in it. So now I have the potential that I could have 2 parts water to 1 part alginate. I don't think that I need more water than that based on my tests, but it's good to kind of have a little bit available. As I said, alginate is one of those materials where you can kind of mix it up a little bit. You can add alginate into your mix if you feel like it's too thin. You can add water in if you think it's too thick. You can't do that with all materials either. So that's a good thing to know too, is that, you have a little bit of play in terms of that. This is my rinse bucket, my cleaning bucket off to the side. I make sure I have my newspapers here, this bucket, and my bamboo skewers. So I'm going to just kind of clear off this area a little bit and get ready to start mixing. I have decided that the position I'm going to be putting my hand inside of this container is going to have 2 fingers up so that I can show you venting if that's something you want to try, and then sort of 2 fingers kind of slightly pointed down. So this would show you, how air does escape if it's just got a slight curve and not a crazy bend, but how venting would sort of help. So that's my goal right now, but through the process of talking to you and mixing, and I might totally forget by the time I get here. This is where it can be really helpful to have a partner to help you. So it might be useful for maybe somebody else to do the mixing, and you just like, if you have a very specific hand position, just to like be ready for that to happen. Or just someone to grab you some newspaper or more water if you need, or something like that. Okay, and again, we want to make sure that we're using the alginate for this process. 1 pound of alginate. Okay, so I'm just doing a double check. Want to make sure I have everything in order. As I said, once I start mixing, the clock starts. So in my tests, I had like 1 or 2 minutes totally fine for mixing and to kind of get my ratios right. And then another minute to kind of get the alginate into the bucket. And then a couple minutes to kind of get my hand in the position. Not actually a couple minutes, like 30 seconds to get my hand in positions. And then I just kind of had to hold it steady for that period of time. So let's get started. You can add alginate to the water, or you can add water to the alginate with this process as well, but based on the buckets I have, etc., I'm going to add my alginate to my water. And even though this is silica free, I'm going to try to be careful about the dust that I generate. I'm also realizing I think I want to mix with my right hand, not my left hand, so you might kind of pay attention to that. Some of the alginate has started falling into the bucket as I've been talking, and so I'm going to start mixing. You can still see there's a big chunk of it back here. It'll get a little lumpy. Just continue that mixing process. If you kind of feel clumps, you can sort of break them up. You don't want to dump this whole thing all at once. You'll get a big poof of dust. Again, adding it sort of slowly. But I don't want it to take too long. I'm nearing the end, and the mixture is thickening up. Not terribly bad, but it certainly is getting a little thicker than I'd like. So once I get this all in here, then I'm going to continue mixing and sort of evaluating. So just so you can see, like, kind of, I have some dry powder, some wet stuff. It's kind of looking this like lumpy consistency. The texture that you're going for is like a creamy yogurt, and this is still just kind of a little bit lumpy. It's not terrible. But I think it could use a little bit more water. The other thing that the water will help do is make, don't add too much to start out with, but the water will make the alginate go a little further because it will add volume. Okay, so this is better. Look at that. That's a little less lumpy. You know, that's a pretty high fat yogurt though. It's pretty thick. So I could possibly add just a little bit more water. So as I said, I had another 16 ounces ready to go. And actually the cool thing is this is landing about what my tests had done. So I had found that 1.5 parts water to 1 part alginate worked pretty good. But I was kind of curious if I could test out a full sort of like 2 parts water to 1 part alginate ratio. So I'm adding a little bit more water. The ratio I've ended up with for water is 24 ounces or 3 cups. Alginate is the 16 ounces or 1 pound. Okay. My table here is high. It's taller than normal tables, and my shoulder is getting sore from mixing. So pay attention to that. At the studio, I usually put my bucket and things on a stool for mixing purposes, just so I don't have shoulder issues. Okay, so now I'm going to pour that alginate into the container, and this is also a kind of a good visual. You can see that alginate is actually sort of oozing out of the bucket. I don't kind of have to force it out, so that's a nice consistency for the alginate. If you kind of have to scoop it out to get it in there, then you probably could have added more water. Now I'm just trying to get the most bang for my buck. Really trying to get as much of that alginate out of the container. I think sometimes I will actually grab a spatula from my kitchen and utilize that. Only because this alginate is like food grade. So this has definitely been more than a minute. I've been talking and sort of not paying too much attention. But I still have a little work time because I have that regular set. So this is the hand that I actually want to cast, and it's got a little alginate on it already, which is great, but you could always take a little and sort of rub it on your hand. You shouldn't need any kind of a mold release on this or anything like that. You won't. It will come out. Okay, so hand position, I'm going to have these two fingers loose and these two fingers up. And actually, they don't have to be in that position when I put them in. I can put them in the bucket and touch the bottom of the bucket and then just barely lift my fingers up out of there. What I'm trying to do is get as much alginate, sort of making the thickness of the casting as possible. And also trying not to touch the edge. You can kind of see my fingertip there. I'm going to try to pull that back and avoid that position. So I'm sinking my hand in as much as I can to just get the most volume out of it. Okay. And now I'm going to put two bamboo skewers in here. I can feel that in my pinky. And also I should say I trimmed the tips off of these a little bit so they weren't as pointy. Okay, so that is on my ring finger and that is on the tip of my pinky. This alginate is still loose. My hand started lifting up. Again, this is super uncomfortable for my shoulder, so I recommend actually putting it a little lower, or standing a little, standing on your tiptoes or something, so that your shoulder isn't so uncomfortable, because you have to sit like this for, again, it could be 5, maybe 10 minutes. And again, as I'm talking, my hand position is changing. My pointer finger and my middle finger were curling, and I wasn't paying attention. So I'm going to get these skewers in place, feel confident that my hand position is doing what it needs to do. And then I'm just going to kind of hang out here for a bit. I can start to feel, if I'm trying to like wiggle my fingers around in there, it's setting up a little bit. And then it's also useful to have your scraps near you, because you can start to get a sense of whether the material is starting to stiffen up based on what is happening with your bucket. So that's still scraping free. That is not ready yet. It's starting to feel a little bit thicker. So this has been about 2 minutes. I'm looking at my timer. But, oh, and the top is getting a little thicker, but it's still not super, super stiff. We're starting to get, you know, I'm lifting this up now and my hand isn't falling out, so it's getting stiffer inside the container. I can also see that it's kind of releasing from the edges. My alginate in my bucket, though, is still not kind of, well, it's starting to peel off, but not in a nice full swoop. So once it really all starts to pull and I feel like that's set, I'll take another look here. I'll see if it's starting to release from my wrist, and then I'll probably wait another 30 seconds before I go and release my hand. I think at this point it's been 5 minutes. So again, water temperature can affect set time, but I had a pretty steady 80 degrees. It also, I think maybe when you add more water, extends the set time by a little bit. Okay, so the alginate in the bucket is starting to kind of tear away from the edges in larger sections. and it's feeling a little less kind of sticky. And the other thing that is kind of happening here is that I don't know how to show you this. There's air coming in through my wrist. Can you see that? This is so silly. But before, the alginate was sealed around my wrist, and now I can see in. There's wiggle room around it. I want to double check that the bamboo skewers are touching my fingertips, and they are. I am twisting them to kind of break them free. In any case, I think that I am ready to release my hand. It has now been 8 minutes, and you know, you don't want to just say it's been 8 minutes, I'm taking my hand out. You do want to make sure it's settled. It was a lot of setup and mixing and cost of alginate, etc. But I feel pretty confident that it's going to come out. I'm actually just going to go ahead and remove those skewers. They're in my way for demoing. So, unearthing your hand. You cannot simply just pull your hand out, because it's likely that you're going to tear the mold and sort of remove some of the detail that is possible with it. So the first thing that you have to do inside of the mold is just start to kind of wiggle and kind of pulsate your fingers a little bit. You're just trying to get actually a little bit of air inside of those fingers. Now sometimes I even, because I have a flexible container, will gently kind of squish on that. Your hand is going to feel like it's like sucked in. So I've freed my wrist and I've got some wiggle room here, but I need to get a little bit more air down into the fingertip area for them to actually want to release, because they kind of are vacuum sealed into here. Oh. But I promise you, you will get your hand out. This is a squishy material. It's like Jello, and if you really were just like having a panic attack, you could tear your hand out of here super easily. Your hand wouldn't hurt. Nothing would happen. It's very easy to tear through. So just be patient. That's sort of the name of the game here. It has been 10 minutes, I now know, since my hand was set inside. But I'm starting to get some air in my fingertips. Okay, so I'm getting closer. I can kind of feel where things have released a little bit, and I'm just kind of pushing back on my thumb and forward with my thumb. A little air just kind of opened up that. Okay, so I think I got my thumb free. Pointer finger, my middle finger was stuck. The pinky and the ring finger are going to be the weird ones because they, were curled up. So I'm going to kind of have to pull things out this way. I also, as I'm pulling them out, try to make my hand narrower by kind of squeezing it together. Okay, I think I'm ready. So I'm going to just slowly pull that out. And there's my hand. And here is my casting. So mostly what you just see is the hollow void. There is some excess alginate here, and I was very careful to try to not get a whole bunch of scraps of alginate around here, because you don't want them falling into the mold. So in fact, I'm actually going to trim these away. Either I could tear them, or I'm going to just carefully and gently cut away at them with my utility knife. Okay. So this is ready to be cast in plaster. Now, I think as I hinted to, alginate is sort of a one and done. You can only use it once and then and then you need to either make a mold of that mold or make another casting. It hardens as it starts drying, and this isn't something that like it hardens in an hour or two, but in 5 or 6 days, if you save some of your alginate mold pieces, it'll just kind of be a hard chunk. So you do want to cast this ideally right after you make it, but you have kind of around like 24 hours to do this casting. So if you can come back and cast right away, fantastic. If you can't, seal this in a plastic bag all the way around, like tie a knot around the top. Try to keep as much moisture in the alginate as you can, and that should help it maintain that softness, so when you go to cast it, it will still have flexibility. So while a dry, crusty alginate mold would allow you to still fill the cavity with plaster, you won't have the softness of the alginate to kind of cut and peel away. And that's why alginate is great, because it can cast really dynamic forms, and then you can just cut it away. So cleanup will be the sort of last thing to talk about with the alginate. So my bucket has a lot of alginate in it, and I don't want that to go down the sink drain. So the cool thing about the alginate is my bucket walls are really smooth, and because it's set up and was, because it's set up, it's just peeling off of the sides of the bucket. I'm using just the side of my finger to kind of scrape it up. Again, a rubber spatula could maybe also do the same thing. But I want to clean up as much of this as I can prior to rinsing it in my waste bucket. This bucket also needs to be cleaned sooner rather than later, because it's likely you'll need it for mixing your plaster. And then I'm just going to toss this. There's nothing toxic about it. You can just put it right in the trash. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I might not even need to use water to clean it, but if I did, I could use my little rinse bucket there. A smooth-walled, like super brand new fresh bucket is easier to clean up than one that has lots of scrapes and other things with it. But we just want the alginate out of there so that when we mix plaster, we don't have alginate bits that will fall into the bucket. My hands, I'm also just going to kind of clean those up a little bit, use a little rinse water before I then go to my sink to wash my hands. And this bucket is the same rinse water that I can use for casting plaster and for washing up my plaster hands. So don't get rid of it just yet. I don't know why I did that. But come back for the next video where I will talk to you about casting plaster into this. You'll need this, your plaster and your extra container to pour your extra plaster in. So come back.